everyone, and welcome to the most recent and exciting episode of OPG Live. Each episode more exciting than the last. I am your host, professional photographer Ian Plant.
I'm your moderator, Leah Zahner.
And welcome. I'm glad that you could join us once again. I never quite know what to say during these opening monologues. Like, I want to say hi, how y'all doing, welcome, and then I want to say it again and again, like it's a bottle of shampoo, rinse and repeat. But I think Leah has some real exciting announcements for us today, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Yes, as promised, I do have an exciting announcement. Today's Q&A is sponsored by Tamron, but we also have a pretty exciting community gallery that we're starting today. You're going to find that below your chat box. There's a link there. If you're watching on Facebook, you're going to find the link in the description. If you click through, we are looking for your best landscape photos, and we're starting an OPG community gallery. Today, during the Q&A, if you are submitting a photo, Ian is going to take a peek at them at the end of the show, pick one, and the winner is going to receive an OPG Gold membership. So if you've got those files, and while we're going through this entire Q&A session, drop them into that photo gallery so we can take a peek at the end and see what's been added.
Just remember, we're asking for your best landscape photos, so make sure it's a photo of a natural landscape. And I am going to pick the best one, so we need more than one submission so that, winning something actually means something. So
keep them coming all the way through the show.
So we're looking forward to seing what you put up. I thought that, any more announcements?
Nope, that's the big one.
That's it. That's the big announcement.
That's what makes it exciting.
Okay, so welcome to, no, I said that already. Actually, today I'm going to spend some time talking about some autumn photography tips. Autumn is just around the corner. As a matter of fact, one of the trees in my front yard is already beginning to turn red. So it's coming pretty quick. Usually for most of the northern hemisphere, we're talking about sometime in October when you're going to see peak fall color. Of course, those of you who are tuning in from the southern hemisphere still have a ways to go until autumn comes. But for those of us in the northern hemisphere, fall is right around the corner, so I thought I would give you some of my favorite fall photography tips. So we're going to dive into a few of the fall photos I have taken over the years. I feel like this episode is going to be awfully alliterative. So is it alliteration when it just sounds the same?
Alliteration is when it starts with the same. It's when it starts with the same letter.
So fall photo is technically not alliterative, even though it sounds like it might be.
It's close.
Okay,
we'll give it to you.
Whatever. Who cares? I don't even know what the word means. I'm just word of the day calendar. So the first photo I'm going to share with you is a photo that I took several years back in Acadia National Park. And any moment now, it's going to flash on the screen. There it is. And this photo is a good reminder that fall color isn't just about the trees. There are a lot of different plants that turn in autumn, including ground plants. You get some ferns that'll turn color. Will go bracken, so they'll take on that yellowish golden hue. You get a lot of ground cover, like for example here in this photo, I think it's blueberry bushes that turn a bright scarlet red in autumn. And of course you get a lot of berries and things like that that can add a dash of color to your autumn scenics. And so for this particular shot, I saw a lot of this red ground cover, and it was surrounding this low-level pine tree. I was in this pine barren area, and so the pine trees were very small. So there was this mix of that red and that green color. So I immediately was attracted to this complementary color scheme, these color opposites that when brought together in a single photo can make the resulting composition much more visually interesting for the viewer. So looking for these color opposites is something you can do a lot of in fall because there is just a very broad mix of colors that you'll see when you're photographing autumn scenics. This next photo is a photo that was once again in Acadia National Park. And for this particular shot, I was photographing autumn color reflected in the water. So the water, it's a small pond that I found, and it's in the shade. And there are all of these things that are growing in the water. You got some lily pads, you've got some other marsh plants that are growing up. And by the time autumn rolls around, a lot of these plants are starting to die off. So you've got these remnants of these plants in the water. And I was immediately attracted to the interesting pattern that they form. So I zoomed in with the telephoto lens. And a scene like this, where you're making a photograph of the color reflected in water in, let's say, a pond or even a moving stream, the best way to do that is to photograph the scene when the reflected autumn foliage in the background is in the sunlight, but the water itself is still in the shade. So here the pond was in the shade, so the pond and all of the plants sticking up out of the pond were not getting any direct sunlight, and instead you can see all that brilliant fall foliage reflected in the water because it's shining so brightly in the sunshine. So having waiting for a nice, clear, sunny day and getting a mix of that fall color in the sunlight and then the landscape itself in the shadow. So the reflected object is in the sun, the reflective surface is in the shadow. That's the best time to make this kind of photograph. Now, we can look down to photograph fall color when trees have lost their leaves, or when you're photographing ground color that has taken on an interesting color, or if you're photographing reflections in the water. Or you can look up. This is a photograph I made during peak fall color in the Patagonia region of Argentina, and I was backpacking in the mountains there, and I came upon this really beautiful grove of trees. They call them lenga trees. It's a species that's only found in South America. And the color was just amazing. And when you can make a photo like this where you look up with a wide-angle lens on a sunny day or a day that's got a mix of sun and clouds, and that's what I have here. So there's some blue sky poking through the canopy of leaves above, and that adds that complementary color scheme once again that is a color contrast with the reds and the oranges and the yellows and even the little bit of green that's still left. So it creates this really interesting color palette that makes the photo much more dynamic, much more visually exciting. So here I was really focused not only on this color contrast, but the pattern that was formed by all of the trees leaning in and snaking their way towards the center of the composition. So I was basically looking straight up. So, in effect, lying on the ground, looking straight up with my camera to get this perspective. And when you use a wide-angle lens, when you're looking straight up, it's going to create a fair amount of perspective distortion. So all the trees are going to appear to lean in. So I chose a composition here where the tree trunks were radiating inward from the edges and the corners of the composition into the center of the image frame. And just remember, at any time, if you have any questions about my photos, feel free to put them into the question chat box. Or if you have any general questions about photography, about outdoor photography, you can leave your questions there. I'll answer questions about my photos as they come in, and any general questions we'll save for the end. So with this next photo, this is just a good reminder that fall color scenics don't have to be grand sweeping landscape photos. You don't have to always be using a wide angle lens. Fall is a great time to zoom in a little bit tighter on some of the intimate details. And so here I found a scattering of fallen autumn leaves on some rocks that were sticking out of a stream. And so I created this intimate composition by zooming in and really just focusing on the repetition of the shapes and the colors and the pattern created by the flowing water. And I promise you, those leaves were exactly how I found them. I did not spend hours collecting leaves on the trail as I was hiking and then scatter them to my liking on the rocks. That did not happen at all, I assure you. You can't see me right now, but I've got my BS face on. So this, well, here it is, my BS face. I assure you that I did not put those leaves there.
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay, so back to the photos. Very convincing. I used to be a lawyer, so I was a professional liar for 8 years. I can trick anyone. If I want to. So this is a shot taken from Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. So these are cottonwood trees, and they turn a vibrant yellow golden color in autumn. And so for this particular photograph, this was kind of in the middle of the day. There was this storm building up in the afternoon heat, and as the storm clouds built up, they created this really nice background for the cottonwood trees. But this shot only works because the sun was still out and it was backlighting the cottonwood trees. I love working with backlighting whenever I can, especially with autumn color, because it makes the leaves on the tree appear to glow from within. So the sun is just outside of the image frame at the top of the composition, shining onto the autumn cottonwoods from behind, backlighting, making them glow, making them stand out against that darker, stormier blue background. So the trick here, once again, think about the color contrast, but also think about the luminance contrast to make sure that you have very effective and successful autumn photos. Now, one thing to consider when you're making autumn photos is to make sure you're in a place during peak autumn color. And there's usually a number of online resources you can check with to find out when peak fall color typically happens in a particular area of the country, and often you can even monitor like live fall color reports from leaf spotters who go out, check out the fall color, and they get back to people. They'll put up a report saying, you know, right now the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is at 95% peak fall color, so you know that's when you want to be up there. And as a matter of fact, that's where this photo was taken. I made this photograph with my drone, so you can see that this was absolute peak color. Just about every single tree that changes with the season has turned color here. The only trees that haven't turned color are the evergreens in this photo. And so, of course, those are not going to change color at all. They stay evergreen, hence the name. So by incorporating the evergreens into the photo, I add a little bit of that color contrast. So with all the maples that are up there, you've got the sea of red and yellow, but that green mixed in adds a little extra color. And then I chose this photograph because of the stream that was snaking through the middle. Now, I made this photograph with my drone, so I'm actually looking above this, and I was able to fly my drone back and forth along the stream to find the best patches of fall color that would complement the blue of that ribbon of stream coming right down through the middle. And I chose a part of the stream with a bit of an S-curve just to make the composition more dynamic, make it more exciting.
You were talking briefly about something that I think spurred some people on for some questions.
Okay.
First is from a guest.
Okay. Hello, guest.
Hello. If you are doing, do you have any advice for scouting locations in the fall? You were talking briefly about some of that research you could do. It's so hard to get the timing right for peak colors.
Yeah, it is. And I think the best thing you can do is to try to spend as much time as you can in an area where the color is changing that you want to photograph. Because quite often, even with these fall color reports, the level of color may vary by elevation. You're at the mercy of the skill of the leaf spotters in determining whether it's 50% color change or 85% or 100%. And so my best advice is that you should have some flexibility in your schedule and choose to be up there for more than just like a day or two if you can. Now, obviously, if you've got work, and you don't really have the ability to have that flexibility. If you can't take off the vacation time, that makes it more difficult. But if you can get the vacation time, I recommend going to an area and planning to spend about a week there around that peak color time and work through it as much as you can. And of course, you can move around a bit. Excuse me. The best thing you can do is go to an area that's got different elevations that you can easily access. So if you're in the mountains and there's some roads that go up into the mountains, that way if you go to an area and down below the fall color's not that good, you can always just drive up to where it's at its peak. So you can cheat a little bit that way if you can. But yeah, it's difficult. Like, you know, for example, I'm going to be going up to the Canadian Rockies soon to photograph the larches. And peak usually happens in that last week of September, which is when I'm going to be there. But I plan to be there for a whole week so that I know I'm going to have a good chance of finding some good fall color somewhere while I'm up there during that time. Okay.
All right. And there's one preloaded question that kind of applies here, too.
Hello, preloader.
Yes, it's from Anna.
Hello, Anna.
And Anna is asking, what is your favorite fall foliage location and subject?
Ooh, well, so, I mean, there's so many places where you can get amazing fall color. You know, the upper Midwest and the upper Northeast is great because you get a lot of maple trees. So you get those brilliant red trees, those oranges, that you don't really find in a lot of other places. If you go out west, like in Colorado, you get a lot of aspen or cottonwood trees in the desert. For example, like if you're in Utah and you're going into Zion National Park in November, you can get some really beautiful cottonwood trees that are turning color. So it's a different color palette. I'm from the Northeast originally, so I kind of like that northern U.S., southern Canada color palette that you find in the deciduous hardwoods. You know, so those maple trees, the sugar maples in particular, to me are my favorite. So I love those colors. But I absolutely love fall color. No matter where it is, you can find amazing fall color subjects in all sorts of places, and there's a lot of variety there. And I love going down to South America, like Patagonia, during the austral autumn. It's a different color palette there, but that's pretty amazing as well. So I don't really have a favorite. Sorry, it's all good.
And finally, another guest is asking, are you using HDR to enhance these photos?
So HDR is high dynamic range imaging, and there's several different ways you can think of HDR. Really, what HDR is exposure blending. You take multiple exposures of the same subject and you blend them together. And so HDR doesn't really enhance an image. It's just something that you use. It's a technique you use when the range from light to dark in a scene exceeds the dynamic range of your camera. So your camera has a limited ability to capture everything from light to dark in a scene. And if that range is outside of your camera's ability, then you need to do something to balance your exposure. And in the old days of film, and some people still use these, you might use a graduated neutral density filter, which was what I would call like pre-computer HDR. So it's a filter that's darker on the top than on the bottom. So you pull it down so that you can make the sky darker and balance the exposure so that the sky and the landscape are more even. I do mostly exposure blending now instead of using a graduated filter, and I only do the exposure blending when I need to balance my exposure. So most of the shots you've seen here, the fall color shots, as a matter of fact, I don't think a single one of them was anything other than a single exposure. So no HDR, these are just single exposure images.
All right.
Okay. All right.
That's it for now. Keep them coming.
We're going to dive back into the photos. Okay. So, for example, a scene like this, it was an overcast day. There was no direct sunlight on these trees, so the light was soft. It easily fell within the range of the camera sensor, so I was able to capture this with one exposure, no need to use HDR. But the key thing here was making sure that I was photographing during that peak color to really get that vibrant color. You've got to work hard to find good color while you're in the field. All right, here's another photograph. This one is from Patagonia in Argentina. And this one shows that even if you're not working in an area that has peak fall color, just a little accent of color can be enough to make a successful autumn foliage photo. So for this shot of a waterfall, you can see most of the trees haven't really turned color yet. There's a little bit of yellowing going on in some of the background trees, but there was this one tree that was in front of me that had already peaked. It was a brilliant red color. So I made that the foreground of my composition. So that little dose of red is all that I needed to make this scream autumn, even though most of the trees hadn't turned yet. And so by getting close to that red tree and filling the frame of my foreground space with that, I make it much more prominent in the composition, and I make this an autumn-themed photo, even though most of the trees hadn't turned yet. And here's another example from Patagonia, down in Argentina. I was backpacking there. I've been down there many, many times. So I've photographed fall color there. Usually the fall color peaks in April there. And this is just an example of a autumn intimate. So I like to shoot wide angle a lot, but I also like to zoom in every now and then with my telephoto zoom and get something a little bit tighter. So when I found this patch of beautiful color on this stream, I zoomed in tight. It was surrounding this boulder that had an interesting shape, so I made the boulder the anchor of my composition, included a little bit of the flowing glacial stream beneath the boulder, and made this an intimate landscape composition. So once again, you don't need to have peak fall color everywhere to make these kinds of shots. You just find those trees that have turned and zoom in on those and make an intimate shot of just those trees, and it tells a story of autumn color even if most of the forest hasn't turned. Okay, and I think, we have reached the end of my fall color photos and fall color tips. Right. So I think at this point, Leah will give you a few more reminders about the photo submission process.
We already have some.
How many do we have?
So it looks, my last check, we've got about 9 to 12.
Exciting.
Maybe a couple more pages even. Oh, look at that.
Oh,
We got quite a few.
Updating live as we speak.
So keep those coming. You're going to submit those. Again, there's either below the chat box if you're watching on the website or a link in the description if you're watching on Facebook. Keep on submitting those photos, and we'll set aside some time at the very end. Again, Ian's going to take a peek through them and pick a winner for a gold membership.
And just a reminder, make sure that they're landscape photos. And please, folks, keep them clean. No dirty pictures. As a matter of fact, those are now outlawed in some states.
It is true.
Yeah.
It is very true. Well, we're going to dive into some questions.
All right, let's dive into some questions.
So some of these were pre-submitted, but I've seen a couple more questions coming in. So keep those coming in as well as your submissions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So first one's from Dale.
Hello, Dale.
Dale asks, if your theme is to capture the colors of the fall, what would you advise a photographer to have in mind?
Okay, well, as I said before, you're definitely looking for those areas where you've got the peak fall color. And one thing that can actually help bring some of that color out is a polarizer filter. So polarizer is designed to remove glare and reflection, and it's most commonly used when photographing like waterfalls and streams. So if you are photographing like a waterfall with autumn colors surrounding it, the polarizer is going to help get rid of the glare on the wet rocks in the stream. It's going to help enhance contrast, but it also will bring out the color in the foliage a bit more. So this is something that most people don't know, but leaves have a waxy surface that's very reflective. So if you use a polarizer in an autumn forest, you have autumn leaves, you will see those colors pop out more because you're going to get rid of the reflection on the leaf, which is just reflecting glare from the sky above. So you can actually enhance the color with a polarizer filter. So it's a bit of a secret weapon.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I hope Sam was listening. That was one of the next questions that he had submitted.
All right.
How do I eliminate glare from the leaves?
You use a polarizer filter. Polarizer is pretty easy to use. You just put it on front of your lens and then you spin the polarizer around. You'll notice as you spin it that the glare will disappear, and then it'll reappear, then it'll disappear, then it'll reappear. So you want to put it in a position where the glare has disappeared and you get more color. Now, a polarizer filter will reduce the amount of light coming into the lens by about 2 stops on average. So that means you're going to have to compensate with a longer exposure or a higher ISO. If you're shooting with a tripod, which you should be doing to maximize image sharpness and to allow you to really fine-tune your compositions, then it doesn't matter if you got a longer exposure. You can do that no problem, unless of course it's windy and the leaves are blowing around. Then you need to increase your ISO so that you can increase your shutter speed to make sure you get a sharp image.
All right.
Okay.
Got a question from James next.
Hello, James. Next.
James asks, in order to achieve deeper saturation in autumn photography, would it be beneficial to slightly underexpose or overexpose my shot?
So that's an interesting question, and that sounds like the kind of question that someone who used to shoot film might ask, because in the good old days of shooting color slide film, we would actually intentionally underexpose our images just a little bit to bring out that color more. Now, this is not necessarily a good strategy when you're shooting digital raw files, because digital noise resides in the shadow areas of your photograph. So you tend to want to do the opposite. Instead of underexposing your files, you want to give them extra exposure. As we say, you want to expose to the right, push your histogram as far to the right as possible without overexposing any of your highlights. And then when you are processing that raw file on the computer, if you want to, you can bring the exposure back down. And if you slightly underexpose the colors, they will pop out just a little bit more. But I mean, you want to do that to taste. You got to be careful because you don't really want to darken the image. You want the fall foliage to be bright and to look bright and colorful. So I would recommend, rather than underexposing the image file or bringing down the exposure too much, let's say, for example, if you're using Adobe Lightroom, you probably can just give that color a little bit of a saturation boost. Just go to the saturation or the vibrance slider and push it up a little bit. You can also go into the individual colors. So let's say you want to boost the reds without boosting the other colors in the image. You can go into the HSL module of Adobe Lightroom, and you can selectively boost that color. I often find, actually, instead of underexposing the color, just brightening it a little bit makes it stand out more in the image and gives it more presence. So I'm often doing the opposite of what I might have done back in the days of color slide film.
All right.
Okay.
Let's move on then.
All right.
We've got a question from Luke.
Hello, Luke.
Luke asked, what settings will be good for taking photos of falling leaves?
So I guess it depends on what you're trying to accomplish with that. I mean, I've never actually tried to photograph a leaf while it was falling. I'm not exactly sure why one would do that. So if you have any further thoughts about what it is you're trying to do, feel free to add them to the chat. I guess if you've got a lot of leaves falling, you could, for example, experiment with a long exposure so that you get the leaves blurring as they're falling, and maybe the wind is rustling the tree leaves, and you can go for an interesting long exposure effect. Otherwise, I mean, if you're trying to freeze the action of the leaf as it's falling, you're going to want a fast shutter speed, or maybe use a flash to freeze that action. But trying to photograph a falling leaf as it's falling is probably pretty difficult because the leaf is going to be moving around quite a bit. So I've never really seen anyone do that before, and so I'm having a tough time answering your question. So if you've got any further thoughts, if you want to clarify what it is you're trying to accomplish, I'm all ears.
I'll keep an eye out.
Okay.
All right, let's move on for now. Rose is asking a question next.
Hello, Rose.
Do you prefer overcast skies for your fall photography?
So that's an interesting question, and I think it depends on what you're trying to photograph. So, overcast skies can look really good. It gives you that soft, even lighting, and the colors really come out. But as I said earlier, I love backlighting with fall color. And so I think my preference is more often than not to work with light. And also, as I said earlier, you want to have sunny weather if you're doing reflections in water. So if you've got the autumn foliage reflected in the water, you want that foliage to be in bright sunlight, even though the water needs to be in shadow. You need that bright sunlight because if it's overcast light, those reflections are not going to look that strong or colorful. So it really depends on what you're photographing. If I'm shooting an autumn waterfall, probably going to want overcast light. If I'm shooting overhead with my drone looking down, probably going to want overcast light. But if I'm down below looking up, maybe at a brilliant maple tree with red leaves, I would love to have that backlit and have all of those leaves appear to glow from within.
All right. Let's move on to another question from a guest. And this question is, what digital filters do you use to punch up the colors?
Hello, guest. I'm not sure what you mean by digital filters. I'm assuming you mean what I might be doing in the digital darkroom to punch up the colors. And as I mentioned earlier, usually it's a matter of selectively brightening a little bit the fall color that I want to have more presence in the photo, and then maybe adding a little bit of saturation or vibrance to really bring out those colors. In terms of physical filters that I might be using, it would be probably the only filter I would use for fall color would be a polarizer to help bring out the colors a little bit more by getting rid of the reflection that's on the waxy surface of the leaves.
All right, Jeff's got the next question. I always have trouble getting the deep, rich color that I see in the scene to show in the camera. So any tips for that?
Well, I mean, there could be a lot of reasons for that. It could be your composition. So for example, let's say you walk out to your local pond and you see some really nice color on the other side of the pond on the trees, and it's an overcast day, and you take out your camera and you shoot with a wide angle lens. And so you've got some of that fall color in the shot, but then you've got a lot of gray sky above it. Well, that gray sky is going to kind of distract the viewer from that beautiful fall color. So for something like that, to really capture the color, you want to isolate that color. So you maybe zoom in and find the most colorful leaves and make a composition of those and exclude that gray sky. So you're focusing all the attention on the color. So that can help get more color. So it's really more about scene selection there and composition selection to make sure that you're including only the most brilliant, colorful parts of the scene and excluding other things. It could also be the lighting that you're working with. So if you're shooting in the wrong kind of lighting, it's going to dull the colors. So as I said earlier, an overcast day might be really good if you've got really colorful foliage surrounding a waterfall. Or strong backlighting might really bring out the colors on a sunny day. But if you're shooting in the wrong light for the scene, then that can really dull the impact of the colors. But I think more often than not, what happens when I see people who are taking fall color photos and then they're not satisfied with the fall color photos is they're they're just not being careful enough with their subject selection, and they're including a lot of stuff that isn't colorful and that is distracting from the color. So isolating the most colorful subject, zooming in and only creating a composition showing those brilliant colorful leaves and excluding anything else, that's usually a good strategy for making sure. But the key thing is to make sure you're actually getting good, strong color to begin with. And I think that's why it pays to do research to make sure you're in the right place at the right time for peak fall color, and to spend a lot of time looking to find the most colorful trees and leaves that you can find. And that's going to help a lot.
All right, let's move on to Danny.
Hello, Danny.
Danny G is asking, if you are doing a panorama of a large area and overlapping 30 to 40%, do you leave autofocus on or turn it off? Do you remeter for changing conditions edge to edge, or leave it on, say, A control and let it adjust itself?
When you're doing panos, your best bet is to make sure everything is set to manual. So you want to focus once, because if you're changing focus each time you swivel the camera, then you're going to have some issues where some stuff's going to be in focus, some isn't going to be. So you're going to have overlap problems there. You don't want your exposure to change at all when you're moving around. And you also don't want your white balance to change. So you want to turn off all of those auto settings and do focus and exposure and white balance manually. That way, you'll be able to stitch your images together a lot easier.
All right, let's move to Armand's question.
Hello, Armand.
Armand asks, how important or relevant is the use of the graduated neutral density filters in landscape photography, given that the modern digital cameras have huge dynamic range, which are able to capture great amounts of tonal range, especially when shooting raw?
I would say Armand, and I love that name, Armand. It's a very sophisticated name. I wish I had that name. I'm going to change my name to Armand. Hello.
He had it first.
Okay. You get to keep it, Armand. I'm just going to say Armand as many times as I can because it sounds so good rolling off the tongue. So yeah, that's a great point, Armand. The graduated neutral density filter is not as widely used as it used to be. I don't use one myself anymore. I think I still have one in my closet somewhere collecting dust. Most digital cameras do have a really great dynamic range, and so that really expands your options. And most photographers these days will use exposure blending or HDR instead of doing a graduated neutral density filter. A grad filter is pretty easy to use. It's a lot easier to use than doing exposure blending, but sometimes it's hard to get natural looking results with a grad filter because you've got this sharp transition line between dark and light in the filter. It's blended, it's a graduated transition, but it's pretty obvious. Like if you're pulling it down over a sunset sky, but you've got trees sticking up into the sky, those trees are going to go pretty dark because they're already in shade to begin with, so they end up looking pretty black in the final photo. So you can get a more natural looking blend doing exposure blending if you know what you're doing. Nowadays with most programs, there's usually some sort of merge to HDR feature built in, like with Adobe Lightroom, where you can just select your exposures from your exposure bracket and easily merge them together on the computer. So it's pretty easy to do it that way instead of doing a graduated neutral density filter. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Thomas has a kind of fun question that we're going to interject in
here.
The
fun questions are the best. So Thomas gets extra points for having a fun question, but loses points for not having a super fun name like Armand. Yeah.
We can't all be Armand. Well, Thomas is asking, Ian, what do you miss most about your previous profession as a lawyer and dread most about your current profession as photography deity?
That is a hilarious question. So what do I miss most about being a lawyer? Absolutely nothing except for the money. So the filthy lucre was incredible. What do I dread the most about my current profession?
As a photography deity.
Extra points for throwing in the deification. You know what? I am going to change my name to Armand. I'm a deity. I can do what I want. I love everything about my current job. I dread nothing about it, and I would never, ever in a million years go back to being a lawyer. So.
Oh, that means you made a great choice.
I think I made the right choice. And let me tell you, the law firm I work for, they think I made the right choice because I was just the worst lawyer you could possibly imagine.
So made a good move.
Yes.
Photography deity. Wonderful. All right.
I'm going to put that on my official biography now. It's going to be on my resume.
I like it.
Photography deity. Nickname, Armand.
All right, let's go to a question from Joe, getting back into some equipment now.
Yeah, okay.
What aperture setting would you use to help isolate a subject from a background?
So you want to use the widest aperture you can to isolate a subject. So the bigger the aperture, the less depth of field that you have. And it's counterintuitive because the big apertures have small numbers. So with most lenses, the biggest aperture is like f2.8 or f4. And so when you have that big wide open aperture, that's going to narrow your depth of field, your zone of apparent sharp focus, to only be around your actual focus point. So the wider, the bigger the aperture, the better for subject isolation. Also, you want to optimize your distance. So if you're far away from your subject, even with a wide open aperture, it probably isn't going to separate that easily from your background. But if you get really close to your subject and you're relatively far away from your background, that is going to maximize the separation, because when you focus on that near subject, that's going to throw the background way, way out of focus because they're on completely different focal planes. So these are your two considerations when you're trying to isolate your subject from the background.
All right, let's move on to Jason's question.
All right, we have a lot of questions today.
Yes, we do. We have time for a few more as well, so you can keep them coming.
Okay.
But we are going to wrap up a tiny bit early to give Ian a chance to look through those photos that you're submitting.
All right.
So Jason asks, do you think sunrise or sunset is better for fall photography, or is there not much of a difference?
There is absolutely no difference whatsoever. I mean, each sunrise and sunset is different. And of course, it's different depending on what you're photographing. I mean, some scenes are going to work better for sunrise or for sunset. But as a general matter, there really shouldn't be any difference between the quality of sunrise versus sunset. Like, I've had this question posed to me a lot. Some people have theorized that, in some places there might be more pollution building up in the afternoon. If you're in Washington, D.C. and it's hot out, then yeah, sunrise is going to be better than sunset. But that's really more of a local effect. Generally speaking, though, if you're in an area where you don't have that sort of thing going on, there usually isn't really any qualitative difference between sunrise and sunset. That said, I do like sunrise better because typically there's no one there. And often you're still half asleep, so you feel like you're walking in a dream. So it makes the whole experience, the folks that are running the show at the production booth right now are laughing at me for saying that. I can see them giggling over that whole, it's like walking in a dream thing. So now they're laughing even more because I'm calling them out for laughing at me. I am a deity. You guys are going to get smitten. I'm going to smite you.
Oh boy.
Sorry,
Getting
I wish
wild.
we had a camera back there so you could see these guys. They're on the floor laughing right now. It's hilarious. So yeah, there's no difference between sunrise and sunset except for the walking in a dream part, which they're gonna never let me live down. So it's like walking in a dream, man. Double rainbow.
Personal preference,
Yeah.
Whatever you like.
It's pretty cool. The trick is don't drink any coffee before you go out there because then you're not awake and you're kind of like walking in a dream. It's like being in that movie Inception. You just don't know what's real and what's not, right?
You just take a bunch of photos while you're out there.
Yes, yes.
Perfect.
So, sorry, I think I went on too long with that whole thing. Let's go on to the next question.
I'm going to pause just for a moment. Bonnie shot in here a little
Hello.
comment. Great explanation of HDR for landscape. So
Oh.
that's from earlier.
Well, thank you, Bonnie.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yes, great comment on my great explanation. Thank you.
Our next question comes from a guest.
Hello, guest.
Would you talk more about the benefits of using a tripod to take your shot rather than just hand holding your camera? I'm looking for inspiration for getting my tripod out of the bag.
Well, okay, so it really depends on what you're shooting. But for me, I'm a landscape shooter primarily. I do a lot of wildlife and travel as well. But support is always a good idea. When you're hand holding, it's kind of limiting you a little bit because you can't do any long exposures. You're limited to doing faster exposures because you want to make sure there's no camera shake in your image. And it also makes it more difficult for you to do things that require precision. So, really precise composition can be a bit more difficult when you're hand holding. If you're anything like me, I'm always shaking back and forth. If you're going to do any exposure blending, that's kind of difficult to do while you're hand holding as well. So a tripod is much more precise. And a tripod also allows you, especially when you're shooting landscape, it allows you to more easily get depth of field so that you can get more of the scene that you're photographing looking like it's sharply in focus. So when you're working in low light, shooting a landscape like sunrise, sunset, twilight, there's not a lot of light to begin with. And let's say you are photographing a clump of wildflowers that are 4 feet away from you with a beautiful mountain, 5 miles away from you in the background, you need a lot of depth of field, which means you need to stop down to a small aperture like f11 or f16, which means you're not letting in a lot of light to record that photograph, which means that if you're hand holding, you probably got to bump up your ISO to something really high to get a shutter speed high enough to get a sharp image, which means your image file is going to be grainier, it's going to be noisier because you're using that high ISO. With a tripod, you don't have to worry about this sort of stuff. You can stop down to whatever aperture you need. You can make sure that you get that really sharp, near to far image, and you can also be much more precise with your composition. You can do things like focus stacking and exposure blending, which you cannot do handheld. So shooting with a tripod opens up a whole new world for you, and it allows you to take much more precise, much more professional photographs. So I recommend it. I use a tripod or some sort of support for almost all of my photography. I do hand holding every now and then, but almost never for landscape, and very rarely for wildlife. And the only time I might do a lot of hand holding is if I'm doing like travel or street photography where you've got to be really spontaneous. Because a tripod does limit your spontaneity, and it's a pain in the rear end to carry around. But I'm a huge advocate of it. You'll never see me shooting a landscape photo without a tripod.
Hopefully that's some inspiration.
Yes.
Take the tripod out of the bag.
Don't be lazy. Get that tripod out. And the tripod comes in handy if there are other photographers trying to take your spot. You can use it as a club and show them who's boss.
All right, we've got a few more questions left, so I'm going to issue a last call for those photo submissions. We're going to work through these last few questions and then pass it on over.
You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
That's true. Roy's got the second to the last question that we have so far.
Hello, Roy.
And Roy wants to know, how important is using a lens hood?
That's a good question. Roy is another great name, by the way. It's not as sophisticated as Armand, but I just like the way Roy rolls off the tongue. So it's a cool name. Good question. I actually never use my lens hoods, almost never. When I'm shooting wildlife, I might use them. So a lens hood is designed to keep stray light from hitting your lens. And so it's a useful thing to have. I just find, most lens hoods these days are these like rigid plastic things, and they just take up a lot of extra space in my camera bag, so I don't bring them along typically. If you could buy like a collapsible rubber lens hood, then it's easier to carry with you. So I don't really use them. If I've got light, like if I'm shooting landscape and I've got light hitting the front of my lens that's causing lens flare, I will just go ahead and shade my lens with my hand or something, like a hat or something like that. I'll do it manually to shade my lens, so that way I don't have to carry around the hood with me. And a lot of times when I'm doing landscape, I'm actually shooting into the light. I'm shooting into the sun. So there's nothing that you can do to shade your lens in a situation like that. So a lens hood would be useless. So about the only time I'm really using lens hoods is when I'm shooting wildlife, and I can't really shade the lens when I need to. And so it's good just to keep that stray light from hitting the lens and causing flare. So you don't need to use one. If you find them useful, by all means, carry them around. But you can get away without using them if you've got a free hand. So if you're shooting landscape on a tripod, then you can do the reach around and block that light hitting your lens if you want to. But if you're hand holding, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So another reason for using a tripod.
Aha.
This all comes together.
Finding more and more. We've got one final question that we're going to get to before I'm going to pull up all of your photos and pass them over to Ian.
All right.
This is from Ayush asking,
hello.
Hi, Leah and Ian. What camera setting would you prefer while capturing photos at night? I know that could be subjective. What lens do you prefer if you can carry just one lens to shoot at night?
This is, well, I guess it depends what you're trying to shoot. I'm going to assume that what you're looking to shoot is like the night sky. So stars, with the landscape maybe. So if that's what you're doing, then you're going to want a wide angle lens. You're going to want a lens that also has a very wide open aperture, like f2.8 or even wider, to capture all of that dim light coming in. And usually, like if I'm photographing the night sky, my settings are typically f2.8, ISO 3200, 30-second exposure with a wide angle lens. If you go longer than 30 seconds, then the stars, which, the Earth is spinning the whole time you're making the shot, so the stars appear to be trailing across the sky. If you do an exposure longer than 30 seconds, they'll stop looking like pinpoints and they'll start looking like trails. So if you want to have those pinpoints or something that looks mostly like a pinpoint, you want to do 30 seconds, 15 seconds or less. So having that lens with a wide open aperture is the only way to get those shots.
So I lied.
Yeah.
I said this is the last question, and immediately 4 questions came in all together. So we're going to try to get through them as quickly as possible.
4 of them. Okay.
Before I pass this over.
I need a drink of water. After saying Armand and Roy multiple times, I'm parched. So go ahead.
All right. So first we've got Julie asking, can you explain what shooting in RAW is as opposed to manual mode?
Okay. So RAW is not actually the opposite of manual mode. RAW is a file format. So you have a choice when you're shooting digital. You can either shoot JPEG or RAW. So JPEG is a compressed file format. It's also already had some adjustments applied to it by the camera. So JPEG isn't really preferred by most serious photographers. They prefer shooting in RAW because a RAW file allows the photographer to make some adjustments, like using a program like Adobe Lightroom or other RAW conversion and processing programs. And then you can make some individual adjustments to contrast, saturation, so you've got a little bit more creative control over the image. So most photographers these days shoot RAW instead of JPEG. If you're shooting JPEG, then your camera's making decisions for you about how much saturation and how much contrast to apply. If you're shooting RAW, you can make those decisions.
All right, let's move right into another guest. It looks like this is from Cheryl.
Hello, Cheryl.
She says, hello, Ian, regarding photos of leaves on the rock with the flowing water. So this is from before, earlier.
Yes. The one where the leaves fell that way.
Yes, of course, perfectly. How do you have a longer exposure to show water movement, yet the rocks are not overexposed?
Okay, so exposure value is like separate from exposure time. So you can have a very long exposure and nothing will be overexposed if the light's relatively dim. That's your exposure value. So, by contrast, even with a very short exposure, if everything's really, really bright, you can still overexpose the image. So for that particular shot, I was probably stopped down to like f11 or f16. So that cuts down on the light. I was using a polarizer filter, so that's blocking 2 stops of light. So even with the available light on an overcast day, I had to shoot at a 1-second exposure just to get enough light to get a proper exposure value. So it really doesn't matter. Like a longer exposure doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be overexposed. Like for example, if you're shooting at night, you can run exposures that are very, very long and still not get enough light to have a proper exposure value. So it really depends on how bright the scene you're photographing is. There's all these variables come into play. So there's the brightness of the scene, the light that's coming into the lens. There is your aperture. There is your ISO. There is whether you're blocking the light with any filters, like a neutral density filter or a graduated filter. And then there's your exposure time. So all of these variables work together to produce an exposure value. So you can tweak one value and tweak the other value a different way and get the same exposure value. So I could have a 1-second exposure. I can lengthen that to 2 seconds. If I don't change anything else, that will make the exposure value higher. It'll become a brighter exposure because I'm letting in more light during that longer exposure. But if I change it from 1 second to 2 seconds and then I lower my aperture from f11 to f16 and I'm letting in less light, then those balance each other out and I have the same exposure value. So all these variables work together to create your exposure value. That was probably far more confusing than it needed to be. I hope that helped.
We got through.
All right.
All right, Marco has a question.
Hello, Marco.
How do I change the lighting settings so that the objects in the foreground are not blacked out by a bright background?
Well, so that is what we were talking about earlier with balancing your exposure. So either you use like a graduated neutral density filter, like let's say you're photographing a bright sunset sky and your foreground is in shadow. And you set your exposure to make sure that sky is not overexposed, the foreground looks dark. So you could use a graduated filter and pull that over the sky, and that'll balance your exposure. That'll darken the sky and reveal more of that shadow detail. Or you can do exposure blending. You can take multiple exposures, one brighter and one darker, and then blend them together on the computer using, for example, Lightroom's Merged HDR. So there's no way you can just press a button on your camera and magically balance your exposures. When you're working with extreme lighting conditions, your camera has a limited ability to capture the range from light to dark. And if the scene exceeds that ability, there's nothing you can do. You have to do some sort of exposure balancing, either with grad filters or with exposure blending to capture that entire range.
All right, let's move on to a question from Jessica.
Hello, Jessica.
Jessica is asking, how can you get your photos into magazines or publishing?
Good luck with that. If you figure that one out, let me know, because the publishing industry has basically disappeared in the past 10 years. Most photographers back in the day used to make a living publishing in magazines, but now no one does because there's barely any magazines left. So I used to publish in magazines a lot. One of the biggest clients I had in the magazine business was Popular Photography magazine, which was the biggest photography magazine in the world until it went out of business several years ago, and I lost my biggest client. And that's basically repeated itself over and over again. So good luck. Probably the easiest way to get published in a magazine is to look for like a small regional magazine and then send them your photos and say, hey, guess what? You can use these for free. If you want to actually get paid anything, well, let me know how that works out for you. So I'm sorry if that answer is not to your liking. It's not to my liking either. I've seen a large portion of my income disappear in the past 15 years as the whole print industry has just gone the way of the dinosaur. So.
All right, let's finish with one more because it's going back to our discussion on tripods. So we'll sneak this one in
back
from a
to tripods.
guest. What is the best tripod to get, and any pointers as to what to look for when buying one?
The best tripod is the tripod that works best for you. It really depends on what you're going to be using it for. I really hesitate to recommend specific brands or models because everyone's got a different budget. The tripod I use, it costs like a lot of money, so some people don't want to spend that much. I think it depends on several factors. First of all, weight. If you have money and your budget's not limited and you want to make sure that your tripod's as light as it can be, get a carbon fiber tripod. They're more expensive, but it cuts down on the weight a lot. If you're doing a lot of landscape work, then you probably want a tripod that's going to be big and beefy enough to handle a variety of landscape scenes, but not so big and beefy that you can't carry it. So my primary tripod, when fully extended, is extended almost to eye level, pretty much. That is good to have a tripod that can go a little bit taller than your head, because if you're working like on a steep slope or something, you may need that extra height. My tripod is carbon fiber, so it's not too heavy. And my tripod's big and bulky enough that I can use it in rushing water, like if I'm photographing in a stream or below a waterfall, without having the tripod get washed away, but not so big that it's impossible for me to carry around. So these are the considerations you want. If you're a more casual user, or if you want to have a super lightweight tripod, like for going out and trekking long distances, you might want to go with like a smaller tabletop type tripod. Like my smallest tripod is a little carbon fiber tripod that when fully extended, it comes up to my waist. And it weighs only 1 pound. And that's the tripod I bring with me if I'm backpacking deep into the wilderness and I don't want to carry my heavy monster. So these are all considerations. There's lots of different brands out there, lots of different models. I hesitate to recommend anything specifically, but those are some things to keep in mind. Stability and weight are your two most primary things to think about when buying a tripod. You want something that doesn't weigh too much and that isn't going to fall apart or fall down while you're taking a photo.
All right. It's time.
It's time.
So I'm going to pass my trusty iPad over to Ian.
Okay.
He's going to go through. There looks like we've got 3 pages of submissions.
Wow. All right. Why don't we pull these?
Exciting.
Why don't we pull all these submissions up on the screen while I'm looking at them?
And then while he's looking, I'll just a quick reminder. Follow OPG Photography on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. And keep more photos like this coming into the gallery. It's going to be really fun to keep an eye on everybody's submissions.
These are all very exciting, and this is going to be very difficult for me to choose the best one.
We're trying to stump you today.
Okay. All right. These are all good. These are all very good. Okay. Oh, that's not a landscape photo. All right. So let me see. There was a few that caught my eye that I think are pretty interesting. These are all good, and I'm just looking at these really quickly. So Let's see, this one caught my eye. That's a nice photo. Let me go back. So ultimately, when you are entering some sort of photo contest and the judge picks a winner, the judge is just picking the photo that he or she likes the best. So it doesn't mean it's actually the best. It doesn't mean that the other people aren't winners as well. It just means that something caught the judge's eye, and that's what the judge picked. So I always tell people whenever I'm judging a contest that you shouldn't feel bad if I don't pick your photo. And also, if I do pick your photo, that doesn't give you an excuse to go dancing around going nah, 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 nah to everyone else. So, all right, let's see. I take my job seriously here, so I'm going to take a good look at all of these. Okay. I feel like I'm close to finding my winner.
All right, narrowing it down. Thank you so much for sending all of these submissions in during this Q&A session. That's really awesome.
Take one more look at this one. I think I like this one.
All right, you may have to flip that around.
I flipped it around. Let me see if we can display that to the audience.
I don't know if we're connected on this particular iPad. No. So this is...
This one. Control booth. Stop laughing at me and show this one. Here.
So
this is our winner.
Can you see the name at the bottom? Who submitted this one?
This is from C.E. Couchman.
Yes, congratulations. So maybe we'll be able to pull that one up. In the meantime, C.E. Couchman, this is Seavers Mountain across from the Maroon Bells in the Snowmass Wilderness area. So that's the photo that Ian has selected.
There it is.
Ta-da!
Thank you, C.E.
Congratulations.
Couchman. And I love that last name, Couchman. Or maybe it's just a nickname. Maybe you don't leave the couch. That's a wise strategy.
Could be.
Yeah. Now,
very important, to claim your gold membership, you'll need to email us with your name, and the email address you'll use is social@outdoorphotography.com, or you can private message in the chat box below. And you'll have an OPG gold membership coming your way. Congratulations.
All right, fantastic.
Other than that, that's
I think
it for
we're done.
announcements.
That was the most questions I fielded in any of these live events, thus proving that, in fact, each live event is more exciting than the previous one. And my voice is almost gone. I'm beginning to sound like a 14-year-old boy going through puberty. So before that happens, I'm going to bid you all adieu. And to thank you all once again for joining us for this wonderful episode of OPG Live. Thank our sponsor, Tamron, for making this event possible. And we hope to see you next time on OPG Live. I'm Ian Plant.
I'm Leah Zahner.
And goodbye. See ya.
Bye.
Good luck out there. Bye.